welcome to America Now. I'm Don Brown. Now, on America Now, we are pro-American. We're proud of our country. We love our military. We do proudly stand for the anthem, and yes, we humbly kneel before the cross. On this show, we are nationalists. We're not globalists. We will never be globalists, and we will never, ever submit to the authority of a global government run by the United Nations or any other earthly global power. Here, we believe in America first and America always. And our focus is through a biblical worldview. And we believe in Ronald Reagan's great vision of a shining city on a hill. Today's topic, we continue in our series on the takeover on the horizon, the left-wing media's tactics of using questions to undermine the truth. And we will examine the media's technique of subtly raising damaging questions to try and undermine our republic. Now, as we have said, this takeover on the horizon is a strategy of controlled demolition where the left-wing socialists use a number of small coordinated dynamite blocks to set off at different times. It's not literal dynamite, but primarily rhetorical dynamite, propaganda, and mind control as they, frankly, seek the destruction of the Constitution. And we must remain ever vigilant. We have no choice. We must fight this controlled demolition with prayer and truth and courage. And we must speak out against it. And while we have a responsibility to expose their lies, always remember this. We must never be ashamed of the most important truth of all, that Jesus Christ of Nazareth, the mighty prophet of God, is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who came to save the world from its sin and to offer salvation to all who believe. That must be front and center in all of our messaging. And frankly, that message is now vulnerable as these socialists try to take over. We've seen in Canada in previous shows, folks getting arrested. We've seen in California where they're trying to turn that sort of talk into hate speech. That, my friends, is what is on the line. In our last session, we began to use and examine the Democratic media as a socialist propaganda tool for the destruction of the republic. I initially planned to move today directly into the next topic in our Takeover series, which is left-wing academia. But since then, some things have happened with the media that frankly warrant our observation. Now let's take a look at this very brief video. It's a little over a minute, and to underscore the points that we will be making, note the questions asked by the CNN correspondents Victor Blackwell and Allison Camaretto. And as you watch, note too some of the comments by the socialist reporters suggesting that President Trump is somehow responsible for the recent tragic massacre at Pittsburgh.
To what degree do you believe, as some of the president's critics have said, that he's responsible for the environment that would have fed some of what we're seeing, this growth in anti-Semitism, based on some of his rhetoric?
I have to tell you, Victor, I've been following anti-Semitism all of my adult life. I have never heard a stronger statement than the statement the President of the United States made yesterday. He said at his rally in Illinois that if you are going to try to destroy the Jewish people, we're going to destroy you. I've never heard a non-Israeli figure anywhere, not a European leader, not an American president, ever say such a strong statement condemning anti-Semitism. And I think
all against the backdrop of the ugliest political climate in modern times, at the center, an unapologetically incendiary president untrammeled by traditional norms of civility.
But what he has been doing is to stoke this idea of globalists, this idea that really has been historically tied to anti-Semitism, that globalists, which often can just be read as Jewish people, are fomenting these conspiracies around the world.
I think the president has not actually allocated resources to deal with it in the right way. And he also has not spoken in the right way in the course of this that has diminished the hate.
Do you blame anyone for what happened there at the Tree of Life beyond the gunman?
Gotcha. Now, welcome back. Did you know what Socialist Democrat George Stephanopoulos calls President Trump? An unapologetic president full of incendiary rhetoric? As if President Trump has a duty to apologize for the anti-Semitic murder in Pittsburgh that marked the killing of 11 people. Stephanopoulos implies, of course, the president and not the murderer is responsible for the death of 11 people. Please, now how disingenuous is that? Then there is a suggestion that because President Trump rejects globalism, and by the way, we reject globalism too, and because he embraces nationalism, and we embrace nationalism, that is, that America is first among nations, and it's our God-given duty to support our country, that this is somehow anti-Semitic. In other words, attacking globalism is somehow construed by the disingenuous and prevaricating press as attacking Jewish people. So let me get this straight, CNN. If we put America first among nations, which is the essence of nationalism, which is what's always happened in this country, even with Democrat presidents like Franklin Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman and John F. Kennedy, that is somehow an attack on the Jewish religion? See, they just make that up out of the air if it's true. Of course, in this case, they just ignore the fact that President Trump just moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, or that he has hailed as a hero in Israel, or that he has cut off funds to Palestinian terror groups, that he has recognized Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, and has a son-in-law who is Jewish, and grandchildren who are Jewish, and a daughter who is converted to Judaism. But please, CNN, don't let any of those facts kind of get in the way of your false propaganda. Now, this very short montage is a quick illustration that shows how the left-wing press is part of the controlled demolition strategy to destroy the Constitution. They are a major part of the takeover on the horizon. The majority of what we hear from them politically is based upon lies and prevarications and false assumptions. And the problem is that the majority of the people in the United States, the majority of our fellow countrymen, are being fed this garbage 24/7. Now, this type of garbage is the reason it appears that Nancy Pelosi will soon be handed the gavel as the next Speaker of the House, and that maybe Maxine Waters will become the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. Pandemic ignorance and our own fear to take a stand will lead to tyranny if we don't rise up from our slumber. Question: if we don't speak up against it, who will? But I want to return particularly to the technique of the use of these disingenuous questions that we saw in this brief clip. Note first that the CNN questioner, Victor Blackwell, see what he did. He asked the question of the Israeli ambassador, Ron Dermer, if President Trump's rhetoric is responsible for the massacre in the Jewish synagogue. Now, to his credit, the ambassador responded in a way to demonstrate the question was ridiculous. And of course it's ridiculous, but regardless of the ambassador's on-mark answer, it's the question itself that's damaging enough, regardless of the answer. Then there's the second question in that clip by CNN anchor Allison Camerata to the Jewish rabbi. You remember that? She asked if the ambassador, do you blame anyone for what happened at the Tree of Life synagogue beyond the gunman? Really? Blame anyone beyond the gunman? In other words, Ms. Camerata, by simply asking her a question and suggesting that someone other than gunman might be responsible. And we all know what she's really suggesting. She is suggesting by her question that the president is somehow responsible for a lone anti-Semitic gunman who kills Jewish people. Now, do you see this technique? Do you see how subtle it is, but how disingenuous it is to try and slickly, by the use of simply asking a question, undermine the truth? I want to talk to you for the moment about the use of questions as a tool of the left-wing media and of socialists in general, but also as a tool for undermining truth and undermining our constitutional republic. But I would also like to talk about how we can use questions, these techniques, also as an instrument of good. Now, several years ago, I was a U.S. Navy prosecutor as a Navy JAG officer. It was my job to prosecute cases under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I had a commanding officer at the time, a Navy captain, who was a JAG officer, and a mentor, who told me something I'll never forget. He said, Lieutenant Brown, the mark of a good lawyer is not always the answers that are given, but rather the questions that are asked. Now, that never left me, but it took a hold of me a couple of years later, and I began to ponder the importance of that statement. The mark of a good lawyer isn't the answers given, but the questions asked. Now, here's the truth, that a question, even an unanswered question, is perhaps the most powerful form of rhetoric and persuasion, both for good and also for evil. We saw this in the video by the undermining questions from the CNN reporters. The left uses this technique all the time, regardless of the answers that are given. The questions sow the seed of dissension and convey messages, frankly, that are based upon a lie. Now, since our program uses the lens of a biblical worldview to analyze world events, we perhaps see the most prominent and the original example of the evil left using questions to undermine the truth as far back as the beginning of the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden. There we see the serpent using this technique of asking the questions of the woman in the garden, attempting to plant doubts in the woman's mind, and he asks, "Did God really say that?" asked the serpent. And of course, in that case, unfortunately, the technique was successful. The question helped sow enough doubt that the woman disobeyed God and sin entered the world, and now we have to deal with death and chaos every day, largely because the evil one used a question to sow seeds of doubt and to undermine truth, the very technique that the left-wing press so often uses today. As we hear and as we know, there is nothing new under the sun. But on the other hand, where we see that which is counterfeit, we also see truth in the opposite of which is counterfeit. We see the Messiah all throughout the New Testament asking questions to underscore points for good, questions that point to truth. Take, for example, his question to Peter, which may be the most important question ever asked in all the history of the world. Who do you say that I am? That is the question that every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth sooner or later must come to grips with. Why do we say that Jesus says this? It is a pivotal question upon which all eternity will hang for all of us and how we deal with it. Then there was the master's question about the Good Samaritan when he asked, who is a true neighbor to this man? Or consider the question that he asked the disciples on the Sea of Galilee during the storm. Why are you so afraid? In those questions, the answers are powerfully present already. Years ago, I read a classic book for trial lawyers. It was called The Art of Cross-Examination by an author named Francis Wellman. It's a small book. It's a book that's powerful and contains a powerful punch about how to ask questions. And one of the first rules is this: you never ask a question unless you already know the answer to it. Questions are powerful tools for persuasion. As we say, both for good and evil. In discerning the difference, though, how do we discern the difference? How do we judge the question? It's simple. Does the question lead to the truth, or does it lead to a lie? The original deceptive question asked by the serpent in the garden led to a lie, to death and destruction. On the other hand, the questions asked by Jesus Christ led to truth. And you know what? Just like Jesus asked questions leading to truth, you can emulate him and you can do the same. Now, I'd like to touch for a couple of minutes on several of the major issues we're being threatened by in our constitutional republic and talk about maybe some questions that you might ask to deal with those issues. When you ask a question, you're not getting into an argument, and it's very effective. Take, for example, the issue of socialism, the evil philosophy that at the end of the day wants to pretend that government is God, that we should worship government, and that we should look to the government and not God to provide all of our needs, physical and spiritual. Unfortunately, this philosophy of socialism has become popular among young Americans, in part because it's glorified in their schools, colleges, and universities, and we're going to do a session on that soon. But when you're dealing with someone who's espousing socialism, maybe you could ask them, think about these questions, and these aren't gospel, but I just want you to think about them. Maybe get a pen and paper and write them down. Maybe you ask them when they talk about the virtues of socialism, ask them, quote, where's the money coming from to pay for all the free stuff that socialism offers? Of course, they won't be able to answer that or give a good answer. And no matter what they try to answer, it's the question that counts. Or you could ask them, what happens when the money runs out? Once again, the question is a question that cannot be answered. If they're a Christian and under the belief that voting for the welfare state is somehow the Christian thing to do, maybe you ask them, where in the Bible or the Constitution does it make it the responsibility of the state to care for the poor? The state to care for the poor. Or you can ask, why is it that the state has spent billions to fight poverty, that we have, since that's happened, we now have greater illiteracy than ever, greater welfare than ever, greater moral failure, and we still have poverty? Now, none of these questions they could answer, but these questions like these and questions others like these just might cause them to think a little bit. And then there's the question of abortion, the greatest scourge on this country in its 242-year history, where 60 million Americans have been slaughtered, innocent babies, since 1973. The abortionists use sanitized phrases like pro-choice or reproductive rights or abortion rights or women's health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They will make contradictory and disingenuous arguments in statements like, well, I am personally opposed to abortion, but I think it should be a woman's choice. Totally contradictory. Now, when you hear statements like this, maybe you could ask a few of these questions. And maybe you ask them, hey, well, what about the baby's right to his body or to her life? Or maybe you ask, what about the pain the baby suffers? Or what happens when his little arms or legs are ripped off in his mother's womb? You could ask, shouldn't the law protect babies from having their arms and legs ripped off? Or should the law not protect the most innocent form of human life? Or maybe you ask, well, aren't you glad that your mother didn't abort you? If they try to say the baby is not a baby, then maybe you ask, have you ever seen an ultrasound? I remember the great Ronald Reagan once saying, you know, one thing I noticed about everyone who supported abortion, that none of them were ever aborted themselves. And then there's the field of evangelism. One of my favorite questions of all comes from the great scientist mathematician Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal was a 15th century French mathematician, a genius, known for his inventions and his contributions to hydraulics and hydrodynamics. Pascal's the guy that invented the hydraulic press. He also invented the syringe that we use now in medicine all the time to inject hypodermic needles and to give people medicine that they need. That was Blaise Pascal. He was a great man, ahead of his time, but guess what? He was a believer. And he had a great question that he used for other skeptics, and it was called Pascal's wager. And it goes something like this. Okay, you say there's no God, and if we die, well, that's just the end of it. I say there is a God, and the only way to him is through his son, Jesus Christ. And if we die without knowing him, we end up in a lake of fire. But if we die knowing him, we're with him for all eternity. Now, Pascal's wager is this. Suppose I'm wrong and you're right. In that case, nothing gained, nothing lost. But just suppose that you're wrong and I'm right, that there is a God and the only way to him is through his son, Jesus. Well, what are the consequences of you not being right in that case? The consequences of not accepting his son in that wager are immense. So are you really willing to take that chance? Are you willing to make that wager? Questions. No other question could be asked in these areas. Many other questions could be asked, and these are just a few suggestions. You know, you do what's natural. My grandmama said the best note in the chromatic scale is be natural. Do what works best for you. But if we're going to take our responsibility seriously to become the salt of the earth, then we must engage the culture for good. There is no option, and time is running out. So consider how you defend truth in the public square, how you can help debunk the lies of socialism. Be prepared with questions of your own to confront the social evils of the day. Be prepared. The great thing about a question, it's hard to argue with a question. Now, we'll be right back after this. I want to take a moment just to talk to you about my most recent release, Last Fighter Pilot. Some of my work are works of Christian fiction, but Last Fighter Pilot, which was released in 2017, is a nonfiction book, and it's about the very final combat mission of World War II. It was flown by a guy, and maybe you can see this picture, Captain Jerry Yellen, who passed away in December of 2017, who flew a P-51 off of Iwo Jima Island on Japan on August the 14th of 1945, the day the Japanese surrendered. Matter of fact, Captain Yellen was in the air with his wingman, a young Jewish guy. Captain Yellen was Jewish too, and his young wingman, Lieutenant Phil Schlomberg, both Jewish pilots, flying the final mission of the war, attacking a Japanese military airstrip, even as the Emperor was on the airways delivering the dual broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. I got a chance to meet Captain Yellen and spend time with him. We were together at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. This book, by the way, Last Fighter Pilot, has been endorsed by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and by the New York Post. The New York Post calls it a must-read. It's been featured one way or the other in all the major papers, the Washington Post, New York Times, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a real blessing to be able to write this. The thing that really excites me about this, not only because Jerry was a great patriot and a great American, but this story of the final mission had never been told in any historical context until Last Fighter Pilot. But it needed to be told, and it's a portrait not only of Captain Yellen, but also the men that he served with on Iwo Jima, who flew bravely into Japanese anti-aircraft fire, who landed their planes on Iwo Jima, which is a small island of only 8 square miles, while the battle was still going on between 80,000 Marines and 22,000 Japanese. It's a story of war, of heroism, of fear, of courage, and of the end of the war. And I hope that you'll pick it up, and I hope you'll enjoy it. It's Last Fighter Pilot, which I wrote and published by Regnery. You can call the number on your screen here at MorningStar. We'll have it in the book in our bookstore, and we look forward to your feedback. Thank you so much. Welcome back. Our thought for the day comes from our first president, George Washington, who said that the harder the conflict, the greater the triumph. And he certainly would know. And that brings us to today's good news, which comes from Jesus in the great Sermon on the Mount. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its saltiness, it is no good except to be thrown out and trampled by men. That's our show for this week. Now, we hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you back here next week. And until then, remember, America first, America always. God bless America.